Okay, my name's Mark Barnes. I'm an instructor for Eco 370, which is environmental economics for the University of Phoenix. And today I have with me Neil Ransom. And Neil is in Kenya. He's a PhD student working on research in Kenya. And let me turn it over to Neil for a minute and let him give further introduction and tell you a little bit about the research he's conducting.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mark. So I'll just introduce myself a little bit. My name is Neil Ransom. I'm a PhD student at George Mason University. I'm just working on my PhD research now here in Kenya. I actually grew up here for 14 years. I did all of my primary and secondary education here, and then when I graduated high school, I went to college in the U.S. And so now it's been about 12 or 13 years, and I'm returning to Kenya to do my dissertation research on climate change issues and with some of the local innovation here, and I'll get into more detail in that in a little bit. So I've been here for about 3 weeks and just been trying to settle and enjoying life in Kenya with all of its surprises, like a troop of monkeys breaking into our apartment this morning to try to steal food. So,
Okay. Yeah, Neil, I've really enjoyed seeing the pictures of the monkeys that you have right sometimes in your apartment. Why don't you tell the students a little bit more about Kenya, since they're particularly interested in the environment. Maybe you can tell us about Kenya and the environment that you find there.
Okay, yeah, Kenya is a very interesting place because it has such a diversity of environments. It has a coastal region on the Indian Ocean, and it's bordered by Somalia, Ethiopia, South Sudan to the north, and then by Tanzania and Uganda in the south and the west. And it also has Lake Victoria on the west. And so towards the west, when you're getting towards Uganda, it's a very lush tropical climate. It actually has rainforest, a small patch of rainforest on its western border by Lake Victoria. And then in the middle of Kenya, you have the Great Rift Valley, which is a huge geological formation that starts all the way up in northern Africa and runs down through East Africa and has a lot of very interesting geological formations there. And that area is mostly savanna, but it's a high elevation savanna, so the climate is actually not, it's not hot, or it gets a little bit warm, but it's not hot like most people think because it has a higher elevation. And that's, Nairobi is located just to the east of the Rift Valley, and so we're at an elevation of about 5,000 or 6,000 feet. And so here the climate is actually, in Nairobi, where I live, is quite ideal. It fluctuates between about 65 and 85 degrees year-round, and so it's kind of the perfect weather. And then as you move northeast towards Somalia, you get into a much drier area, much more arid region and desert, and that desert kind of runs into savanna as you go south, but then when you get towards the coast, the coastal region, that's a little more green than the rest of the region. So a lot of savanna where you would have, like grasslands with some scattered trees, and which is actually a very what's the word? Very productive ecosystem and can support quite a lot of life. And so you have huge herds of migratory animals like zebras and wildebeest and a whole host of animals that also live off of the grasses or off of the herbivores.
Okay, well that's really interesting. Well, I didn't realize that the temperature was like it is in Nairobi. I always assumed it was much hotter than that. So that's kind of a real interesting
Yeah,
summer.
yeah.
Maybe you can tell us a
Oh,
little.
and I'll say that
Go ahead.
I was just going to say that the equator actually runs through Kenya, divides Kenya in half, and so Nairobi is actually located 2 degrees south of the equator. But if you drive for about an hour, you'll cross the equator. And so once you get down out of the highlands where we are, it actually can get very hot. Like in the coastal regions, is very very hot climate.
Okay. Well, thanks. I know there are a lot of different people in Kenya, different tribes, different religions. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about the diversity of people you find in Kenya.
Sure. Kenya is actually a very diverse country. It has many different types of tribes, and each of those tribes would have a distinct language that they speak. Kikuyu is the largest tribe. It makes up about 22% of the population. There's also the Lua, the Luo, the Kalenjin, Kamba, Kasi, the Meru, the Maasai, which is also one that most people have probably heard of. And then the Swahili people are kind of a coastal people that live on the coast. So 99% of the population in Kenya is African, and the remaining 1% is made up of foreigners. That includes Asians, Arabs, Europeans. So very diverse people, also very diverse in religions as well. The vast majority is Christian, but then there is a very sizable population of Muslims, especially in the coastal regions and towards Somalia.
Okay. My daughter was in Kenya about a year and a half ago, and I remember she and her then fiance spent some time with the Maasai, and
Okay.
that was interesting to see because they're, I understand, built around cattle, and so they had cattle everywhere, and that was really interesting for me to learn about. How about industry in Kenya? What types of industry and jobs do people do?
Sure. Well, let me just say one more thing about the people. Kenya has about 46 million people, so it's the 30th largest population in the world. But it has a very low population density because it's a large country. But what's unique, not unique, but what's interesting about Kenya's population is that it has a very young population. Almost 42% of the population are under the age of 14. And so it has a much, that is a unique set of challenges for a country that has such a young population versus some of the other challenges that we have in developed countries with a very old population. But so that also impacts the economy in unique ways because you have such a large young population, and so finding jobs for all those people, is one of the big challenges that the Kenyan economy faces. As far as the industry and things like that, Kenya would be considered a developing country. It has, their GDP is around 41 billion, but the per capita is only about $976 per person. So that's about $3 a day is the average, the per person, the per capita per person. And so the vast majority of people in Kenya are very poor. That said, Kenya is considered the most developed of the East Africa, or the most developed of the East African countries, and it has, or the most industrialized of the East African countries, and it has large manufacturing industries, now including some of the major manufacturing industries include cement. They also do petroleum refining from a lot of the petroleum that's pulled out of the coastal regions. They also do a lot of food and household goods and chemical manufacturing, beer, plastics. They do a lot of refining of petroleum into plastics. And most of that is for local consumption or for consumption in the East Africa region. And they also do a little bit of car manufacturing, where they'll get kit cars from, they'll get basically parts sent from Japan or Europe, and then they'll assemble them here for local market as well. So industry represents about 15% of GDP. The vast, the biggest employer in Kenya would be agricultural industry, which employs about 80% of the population. And agricultural products, including tea, some coffee, flowers, and some fresh produce. All of that's exported to Europe, and is about 50% of their exports. The other major economic industry would be tourism. It's a huge, it's one of their primary sources of foreign currency, so it's a huge draw for people to come on safari and see the animals, or to go to the beaches, because they have very nice beaches.
Okay, well, thanks, Neil. Just to give my students some perspective on income, per capita income in the U.S. is in excess of $40,000 a year. So to have a per capita income of less than $1,000 a year, you can see that that's quite a discrepancy between a country like the United States and Kenya.
Yeah.
Neil is doing some really interesting work, as he mentioned. It relates somewhat to climate change, but also coming up with some ideas that are helpful in that area, and also helpful just to the health of people in a country like Kenya. So, Neil, why don't I have you talk a bit about the ceramic stoves that you are working on?
Okay, sure. So one of the big issues that I'm looking at is is the intersection of climate change and sustainable development. So the idea is, how do we continue to develop and build Kenya's economy, but also address climate change issues? Because one of the easiest ways to develop would be to consume more fuel, right? That's the fastest way to develop, is like China has been doing, is building coal-fired power plants and using that energy to drive industry and manufacturing and local consumption. But the problem is that produces a lot of greenhouse gases. That's our fossil fuels is our primary source of greenhouse gases, and so we have to figure out ways that we can continue to pursue development without causing, we're trying to figure out ways to pursue development without also producing more greenhouse gases. Now, not to say, like, in the grand scheme of things, Kenya has very little effect on the climate as far as the amount of greenhouse gases that they produce, because people here just don't use the amount of energy that we use in the West. And so even if they were to double or triple or even quadruple the energy that they use, it would still be minuscule in comparison with what the Western world uses. And so, having Kenya stop, we're not going to solve climate change by having Kenya by stopping them using fossil fuels, because they aren't the ones that are driving it. However, that being said, we can find ways that we can adapt to climate change, or even mitigate the little greenhouse gases that Kenya does emit, while also enhancing development. And one of the ways that many people have perceived as a very effective way is to distribute fuel-efficient cook stoves. Because traditionally in Kenya, most people, not so much in Nairobi, but in the rural areas where the majority of the population live, most people use an open fire to cook and heat their homes. And so they basically go out and collect wood and then burn the wood in their home and put a pot over. They call it a three-stone fire, because they put 3 stones together, they put their pot on top of the 3 stones, and there's a fire underneath. Well, the problem with that is it's the least efficient way to cook food, and secondly, because it's an inefficient burning method, it also produces a lot of pollutants that are harmful to people's health. So, for example, when you burn an open fire, you have all of that smoke that if you're camping and you're by a campfire, you can't really breathe very well when there's all that smoke in your face, and so you move out of the way. Well, the problem is in many of these homes where people are using open fires, the smoke is just pouring into the house and remains there. And so air quality issues, especially for women and children under the age of 5 who are indoors all the time, are a major anyway, it's a major contribution to poor health for many people. In fact, in Kenya, the 4th leading cause of death, hospital death, is because of respiratory-related diseases associated with indoor air pollution, especially with women and children under the age of 5. And so here's a way that if we can get people to use fuel-efficient cook stoves, that reduces the amount of pollutants in their homes, and so that improves their health. And so that's a development indicator. If you have better health, you're able to do, you can do more economic activity, you can get an education, you can do so many other things that you can't do if you have poor health. So it enhances people's health when you have better air, when you're using these fuel-efficient stoves. It also allows women and young girls more opportunities because they can spend less time buying or collecting firewood because the stoves use less fuel, and so they can use that extra time that they have to do other things like they can engage in economic activities, or they can go to school or gain training, and many times where women have to go and collect wood because there's so much demand for fuel, they go farther and farther and farther and put themselves in kind of dangerous locations. And so this also, so you have these development indicators with health and gender inequality that a fuel-efficient cook stove helps address. And then on the climate change side, you're reducing deforestation, which is, we know that carbon is captured in trees and plant matter. And so the more plant matter and trees we can have around, the less carbon is in the atmosphere. So it reduces deforestation. Also, burning open fires produces what's called black carbon, which is a short-term climate pollutant, but it actually has a very strong effect on the climate. And so what I mean by a short-term climate pollutant is that if you stop releasing black carbon into the atmosphere, within about a month, all of that black carbon will come out of the atmosphere through, when it rains or wind or things like that. It'll come out of the atmosphere, and so that black carbon will actually, it's a short-term solution where you could, if we eliminated black carbon, it would actually slow climate change down for a little bit. Although carbon dioxide and methane are the primary drivers, this would actually help in the short term. And so this would actually give an opportunity for Kenya if they could reduce their black carbon emissions through these fuel-efficient stoves. Then when they go for negotiations, for climate change negotiations, they might have a, something that they can put on the table in that regard. So that's what I'm primarily looking at, is how these stoves can address climate change and development, simultaneously, and how, if we could find other technologies that do a similar thing to that.
Okay, well, great.
So let me actually.
Sure, go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to ask you about maybe if we wanted to talk about the manufacturing of the stoves, but go ahead with whatever you were going to talk about.
Sure. Yeah, that's what I was going to talk about. So one of the cool things about these the Kenyan ceramic Jiko stoves, which people just call Jikos or the KCJ, is that it was actually invented by a local professor in the 80s. He invented the stove as a way to address deforestation. I don't think when he was building it he had any idea, he was concerned about climate change at all, but basically it was to stop deforestation. And these stoves, what he did was many development groups had been trying to introduce fuel-efficient stoves, but one of the problems is that when they would make them in Europe or in somewhere else where they could get them manufactured. But the problem was that they weren't designed for local needs, and they were way too expensive. And so they would bring these stoves over, and they would give them to people, and then people would use them once or twice, and then put them in the storage, put them outside because they just didn't work for the way that local Kenyans cooked. Or when they would break, there was no way that they could replace them or afford to buy another one. So Dr. Kenyon Dewey, who came up with the KCJ, he came up with a stove that uses scrap metal and clay to create a stove. So it's a metal base around the stove with a clay liner, and that clay liner helps capture the heat and releases it slowly, and so it doubles the efficiency of just using an open stove. And he decided to partner with local informal manufacturers. So these are people anyone who basically just uses manual labor and very rudimentary tools to manufacture products. And they're informal, meaning that they aren't part of the formal system. They aren't taxed. They aren't, there's no real oversight over who's making these products. And so these informal manufacturers are called juakali, is the local name for that, which means working under the sun, because these people would basically work out in the sun without any shade over their head, and that's where the name came up. And so it has all these, so on the one hand, one of the big advantages of using juakali workers is that you're producing a product made from reclaimed metal and clay, basically the two cheapest source materials that you can find, and so they're able to make these stoves for about $3 or $4 is what they sell for. And so even people who are living on $3 a day, they could afford to buy one of these stoves, whereas alternative stoves are made in China, which cost maybe $50 or $60. There's no way that they could afford to buy them. And so the Jiko stove has actually been very successfully disseminated because it's so affordable and because it's just made locally with found material. And there's no intellectual property on the stove, and so people can just copy it and manufacture a new version. And so basically what's happened is a whole dissemination of knowledge, where before it used to be one group of people manufacturing the stove, and now you'll find manufacturers in every small town who can make these stoves or repair them.
That's interesting. I'm curious about the attitude of the government towards it, given that it's sort of outside the main or the regulated economy anyway.
Sure. So basically the informal economy has many positive and negative attributes. One of the positive aspects of the informal economy is that there's no barrier for engaging in employment. Anyone can go and get a job in the informal economy. You don't need training. You can learn to work on the side. There's no upfront cost to start a business in the informal economy. On the downside, though, is that you have very poor oversight and there's no regulations, and so people's working conditions are much worse than they would be in the formal economy. And because there's no barrier to entry, there's a lot of competition. And so basically it's a way to distribute goods and services at the cheapest possible price in a very efficient way. But on the downside, it doesn't allow for a lot of wealth accumulation, and it can also be very dangerous or employ like child labor or things like that the formal economy wouldn't be able to do. But in Kenya, 75% of the people employed basically work in the informal economy, because there are just no jobs in the formal economy for them, and the formal economy doesn't provide the goods and services at an affordable rate to people who are living on $3 a day, or in an efficient manner. And so the informal economy has kind of formed to fill in the gap that the formal economy has left behind, and it provides all these goods and services, including transportation, manufacturing, buying and reselling of goods, services, including you can get your car fixed, you can go to a barber shop, all sorts of things, all done in the informal economy. And so on the one hand, Kenya doesn't benefit from. So Kenya loses tax revenue because these people don't pay taxes on the exchanges that they make. However, when they buy their raw material that they sell, they buy it from a formal source, and so in that regard, someone is paying. They pay the sales tax to buy something, and then that they resell. Like if a car mechanic, informal car mechanic, buys parts for the car, he has to buy it from a formal shop, and so the taxes are paid there. But when we're getting the car service, doesn't pay any. So indirectly, the informal economy does pay taxes, but it's not like the formal economy where it's very visible. So that's one downside, but on the positive side, it does provide employment for the 2/3 of Kenyans are employed by it. So without the informal economy, Kenya wouldn't have the employment that it does.
Okay, thank you. And just an aside for my students, think about that when you're talking about measures of gross domestic product, or, as we were talking earlier, per capita gross domestic product. When you have a country where much of the economy is outside the formal and thus outside the measured economy, it can get a little bit tricky. You end up making some guesses that aren't necessarily real accurate. Neil, were you going to show some pictures or try and do some of that?
Yeah. Yeah, let me just do a screen share and I'll show you a few pictures. Okay, let me just get this working. Okay, so you can see my screen?
Yes, I can see it.
Okay, so this is just an example of some of these informal manufacturers, Jua Kali workers. So even all the furniture that you would get made in Kenya, most of it's made by these informal manufacturers.
Right
and they
now,
can make furniture.
Yeah, right now we're just seeing the just the files. We're not seeing the picture.
Oh. Okay, let's see. Let me try that again. So, oh. Okay, so do you see the picture now?
Now I see the picture.
Okay, so here's an example of informal manufacturers making furniture. So you can see bamboo or straw mats at the bottom, and then furniture that they've made for sale. And then, a Jua Kali worker, we kind of think that they make very simple products, but in fact they can also make very advanced products. This machine that this Jua Kali manufacturer has made is it strips or it grinds corn cobs and grasses, so you can make you have a ground product that you can use to make for fuel or whatnot. Here's a home or a Jua Kali made iron, so you fill it with coals, and then you can iron your clothes with, it'll heat that plate. So people who don't have electricity but still need to iron their clothes, here's an option for them made by Jua Kali manufacturers. Here's also another, so this is an example of using reclaimed metals. These are all tin cans that have been turned into kerosene lanterns. So you see they have a little small hole where the wick will come out of. People will fill that with kerosene and light it at night if they don't have electricity in their homes. All of this is made from scrap metal that they've pulled out of the garbage. So here's another example. This is from an informal market that's just about a mile from our house called Toy Market. And one of the big things that they sell is metumba, which is basically clothing and household goods from Europe or the US that they basically bundle into these 2,000 pound to a 1 ton bundle, and they buy them wholesale. It's basically all the used clothing and household goods that didn't sell at a secondhand store in the US. So like Goodwill will sell all their stuff, and so we can go to the market, and we went last week, and you see all the stuff that was for sale in the US. They have it for sale here, but all at very low prices that anyone could afford. So people who are living in less than or on $3 a day, they can come and buy household goods here with at a price that they could afford. And then let's see. Okay, so this is a picture I took yesterday just after it rained. But so you might even have an informal. I think this is supposed to be a nightclub, but basically like a restaurant that's informal that people can go to. They don't pay taxes or anything like that. So informal economy, very complicated, and it covers basically almost the entire range of goods and services that you would find in the formal economy. I'll just point out this M-Pesa thing. You can see right here. Mm-hmm. M-Pesa is a way to exchange money using your cell phone that was invented by the leading cell phone carrier a few years ago, and it allows people to send cash via cell phones securely. And this M-Pesa has basically revolutionized the Kenyan economy because it has allowed people to send money safely in a way that they've never been able to do before. And because 70% work in the informal economy, very few people have bank accounts. And this way you don't have to have a bank account. You can put money on your M-Pesa account, and it just is safely there. Only you can access it, and then you can buy and sell with it. So, and this cell phone technology has been so successful that developing countries throughout the world are now trying to duplicate it, including M-Pesa has opened in India and all of East Africa. So this is a very interesting approach as how technology can change, change situations like Kenya.
So are cell phones in Kenya generally individual, or are they sort of shared?
So Kenya has about 2 cell phones per person.
Oh, wow.
Is almost the average. Yeah, cell phone adoption rate in Kenya is actually higher than in the United States, because to buy a cell phone is basically $1.25 buys you a SIM card, so you can get a cell phone, and then you just put a couple dollars on there, and you can use your cell phone. So, yeah. Anyway, I digress.
No, that was really interesting. It's an area I've been interested in anyway, cell phone use in the developing world. So, well, this was fascinating, Neil. I really appreciate your time to come and do this, and we'll be sharing this with my students, and I appreciate your willingness to talk to them.
No problem. Thanks so much for letting me chat, and it's always a pleasure.
Okay. Talk to you soon, I'm sure.
All right. Thanks.